December 26, 2004. A perfect, sun-drenched morning across Southeast Asia. In Phuket, Thailand, the ocean does something impossible. It pulls back, not like a normal tide, but a great, silent inhalation, exposing a vast, alien landscape of wet sand and coral. The usual roar of the surf vanishes, replaced by an eerie, breathless quiet. Fish, suddenly stranded, flap helplessly on the sand. The air smells of salt and exposed seabed. It's the day after Christmas, high season. Beaches from Thailand to Sri Lanka are dotted with people. On the sand, a strange curiosity takes hold. Tourists and locals alike begin to wander out onto the newly revealed ocean floor, picking up shells, pointing their cameras at the bizarre spectacle. It feels like a gift, a once-in-a-lifetime marvel. In Banda Aceh, Indonesia, a young nurse, her headscarf fluttering in the breeze, steers her scooter through the morning traffic. She's heading to the clinic for her shift, the normal rhythms of a Sunday morning guiding her path. In Khao Lak, Thailand, a lifeguard scans the water from his tower, his brow furrowed not by danger, but by confusion at the receding sea. He's never seen anything like it. Near Peraliya, Sri Lanka, a family walks along the coastal railway tracks. The ocean just a stone's throw away, now strangely distant. In the Maldives, a seasoned fisherman, mending his nets, eyes the unnatural low tide with a deep, unsettling suspicion that years on the water have taught him. But on Macau Beach in Phuket, a 10-year-old British girl named Tilly Smith feels a jolt of terror. She's seen this before, not in person but in a geography lesson just 2 weeks earlier. The sea drawing back, the water frothing and bubbling like a soda. "Tsunami," she says, tugging frantically at her mother's arm. "Mummy, we have to get off the beach. There's going to be a tsunami." Her parents try to calm her, but her panic is infectious, born of a chilling certainty. They don't know it yet, but minutes earlier, at 7:59 a.m. local time, the world had fractured. Deep beneath the Indian Ocean, off the coast of Sumatra, a catastrophic event had unfolded. A section of the Earth's crust, 1,000 kilometers long, violently ruptured. It was a magnitude 9.1 megathrust earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded. The seafloor was thrust upwards by several meters, displacing a volume of water almost impossible to comprehend. This is why the sea receded. Imagine a colossal wave, a mountain of water, moving across the ocean. Like any wave, it has a peak and a trough. What millions of people were witnessing wasn't the wave itself, but the trough arriving first, the ocean being sucked back to feed the monstrous wall of water gathering its strength just beyond the horizon. It was a deceptive, fatal invitation. Holiday makers were having breakfast in beachfront hotels. Fishermen were preparing their boats for the day's catch. Churches and mosques were about to open their doors for Sunday services. The world was waking up to a beautiful day, completely unaware that it was balanced on the knife's edge of history. Then, the first signs of the true horror began. A low rumble, a deep-throated growl that seemed to come from the earth itself, started to vibrate through the sand. Far out on the horizon, the line of the sea began to bulge, to swell into a dark, menacing ridge. Seabirds took to the air in a panicked cloud. The people who had wandered out onto the exposed seabed, their curiosity turning to ice-cold dread, finally turned to run, but it was too late. The wall of water, no longer a distant bulge, but a solid, charging must, was rising, accelerating, moving faster than any human could possibly outrun, and it was about to make landfall. The clock had struck 8 a.m. in Banda Aceh. For a few heart-stopping seconds, there was only the sound of a monstrous, gathering roar. Then, the Indian Ocean erased the coastline. What were once bustling streets with mopeds and market stalls became churning, debris-filled rivers in an instant. The water didn't just flood. It attacked, it tore at the foundations of the city, peeling concrete from buildings like fruit from a rind. At a small coastal clinic, a nurse screamed as the wall facing the sea disintegrated. She grabbed the arms of 2 elderly patients, half carrying them toward a staircase as the first torrent of water smashed through the ward, sweeping beds and medical equipment away in a brown, violent froth. Miles away, across the Andaman Sea in Khao Lak, Thailand, a veteran lifeguard stood on his tower, his face a mask of disbelief. He saw the sea pulled back, exposing the reef in a way he'd never witnessed. He knew what it meant. He grabbed his megaphone, his voice cracking as he bellowed at the stunned tourists on the sand. "Run! Run to the hills! The water is coming!" His shouts were joined by hotel staff, who began a frantic, desperate banging on guest room doors. Some, remembering the schoolgirl Tilly Smith's warning from minutes before, didn't hesitate. They abandoned their breakfasts, their belongings, and scrambled for the highest floors, for the hillsides behind the resorts. But others lingered, drawn by a morbid curiosity. They stood at their windows, phones in hand, filming the strange, empty seabed, oblivious to the fact they were recording their final moments. In Sri Lanka, the Queen of the Sea express train was chugging along the picturesque southern coastline near the village of Peraliya. Passengers gazed out at the palm trees and the sparkling blue water. The first swell was deceptively gentle, washing over the tracks with a soft hiss. Then came the second. It was a solid wall of water that slammed into the carriages with the force of a freight train hitting another freight train. Steel buckled, windows shattered. The carriages began to fill with terrifying speed. Panic erupted in the confined spaces as families were torn from each other's grasp, the water rising from their ankles to their necks in seconds. People clawed at the ceilings, desperate for a pocket of air, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the ocean that had invaded their world. The physics of the event were as brutal as they were simple. The waves had crossed the open ocean at the speed of a jet, an invisible pulse of energy traveling just below the surface. As they reached the shallow coastlines, that energy surged vertically. The second and third waves were often the deadliest, taller and more powerful than the first, arriving when initial survivors thought the worst might be over. And then came the undertow. It was a malevolent force, a backwards flowing river that dragged people, cars, and entire houses back out to sea. Survivors who had managed to cling to a rooftop or a tree found themselves pulled back into a maelstrom of splintered wood, twisted metal, and the unimaginable debris of a shattered world. Everywhere, the sounds of civilization were being extinguished. Warning sirens, where they existed, wailed for a few moments before being short-circuited by the flood. Mobile phone networks, overloaded and then physically destroyed, went dead, severing last goodbyes. But above the chaos, other sounds emerged. The frantic, desperate clang of a temple bell from a hillside monastery, its monks trying to warn villages further inland, the splintering crash of buildings giving way, and the constant, terrifying roar of the water. In the churning currents, people faced impossible choices in split seconds. A man saw his wife and his child swept away in different directions. Who to swim for? A family reached a staircase, only to see it collapse, turn back into the current or try to climb the debris, cling to a floating log that was already sinking under the weight of others, or risk swimming for a distant rooftop. Every choice was a gamble with life and death. And as the people of Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka fought for survival in a world turned upside down, the disaster was far from over. The same silent, powerful energy that had just obliterated their homes was still racing outwards. It was moving relentlessly across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, a tsunami multiplying in scale. It was heading for the coasts of India and the low-lying islands of the Maldives. It was even traveling towards the distant shores of Africa, thousands of miles away. In many of these places, people were still sleeping, completely unaware. The largest wave hadn't even arrived yet. The wave, now a silent, monstrous pulse, raced across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, a force of nature unbound by borders. It was no longer just an Indonesian story. In Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, along India's southeastern coast, the sea suddenly pulled back, exposing the seabed in a way no one had ever seen. Old fishermen, their skin like cured leather, knew this was a terrible omen. They screamed at their sons, racing their catamarans and trawlers not towards shore, but out towards the deep. Open water their only chance to ride over the monster. On the beaches, Families who had been enjoying the Sunday morning sun suddenly saw a dark line on the horizon. Panic erupted. People sprinted inland, their shouts swallowed by the growing roar. Hundreds of miles south, in the Maldives, the Paradise Islands were about to be erased. These atolls, many no higher than a man's shoulder, offered no high ground. The water didn't crash. It rose relentlessly, swallowing entire islands end to end. Luxury bungalows on stilts were swept away like driftwood. Entire communities watched as their world disappeared beneath a placid, yet deadly, turquoise sheet. Further east, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, remote indigenous communities were utterly cut off, their ancient ways of life facing an existential threat from the salt water that poisoned their wells and gardens. Back in Sri Lanka, near the town of Peraliya, the Queen of the Sea Express train lay mangled, a metal carcass torn from its tracks. But amid the devastation, humanity shone. Local villagers, themselves having lost everything, rushed to the wreck. They used rocks and bare hands to smash windows, forming human chains to pull dazed and injured passengers from the flooded carriages. Just as they pulled a young girl to safety, a second, more powerful surge slammed into the train, tearing it apart and sweeping away both rescuers and survivors. It was a scene of unbelievable courage and unspeakable horror. Yet, in some places, old knowledge saved lives. On Indonesia's Samulio Island, just off the coast of Sumatra, the elders reacted instantly to the violent shaking. They didn't wait for the sea to retreat. They ran through the villages, shouting, "Smung, smung, smung," the word from their oral history. A warning passed down through generations after a similar catastrophe in 1907. It meant run to the hills, because they listened to their ancestors. Thousands on the island survived. There were other strange whispers, too. Reports trickled in from Thailand of elephants trumpeting and breaking their chains, moving to higher ground long before the wave hit. Dogs howled inconsolably in coastal villages. It was as if the animal kingdom sensed the coming doom. But for the humans, communication was severed. The moment the waves struck, it was like a switch being flipped. Power lines snapped. Phone lines went dead. Radio stations fell silent. A communications blackout descended upon the entire region. In the chaos that followed, the most painful question was simply, where are they? In makeshift triage centers, set up in schools, mosques, and churches, names were scrawled on pieces of cardboard. People wandered in a daze, holding up faded photographs, their faces etched with a desperate hope. The search was relentless and heartbreaking. Hands, raw and bleeding, sifted through debris. A single child's shoe half buried in the mud. A soaked passport, its photo barely recognizable. A fishing boat perched impossibly on the roof of a two-story house. These were the fragments of countless shattered lives. As the hours passed, the scale of the disaster began to dawn. The number of unaccounted for went from thousands to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The water, a toxic soup of sewage, chemicals, and salt, covered everything, breeding disease. Morgues were overwhelmed within hours. Then, a new sound cut through the silence. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the first helicopters. They appeared as specks on the horizon, the vanguard of a global response. As they flew over the coastline, their pilots relayed the shocking truth to a stunned world. This wasn't a local tragedy. This was a disaster of continental proportions, stretching across a dozen countries. The world was just beginning to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. But as the immediate fight for survival began to shift, a new race was in a race against a second, silent wave of disease, hunger, and time itself. The roar of rotor blades slices through the humid air over ASA. One after another, helicopters descend, kicking up dust from what was once a bustling coastline. Offshore, a new horizon has formed. Naval ships from India, Australia, the United States, and Japan stand sentinel, their gray hulls a stark contrast against the turquoise sea. On the ground, the response is a tidal wave of its own. In what used to be a soccer field, a field hospital rises, its white tents, a symbol of urgent hope. This is the world's response, a massive, unprecedented surge of humanity rushing to meet an unimaginable disaster, but the scale of the effort is matched only by the scale of the chaos. Air traffic controllers, suddenly managing one of the busiest airspaces on the planet, create strict flight corridors to prevent mid-air collisions. On the ground, the arteries of aid are blocked. Roads are either crushed into rubble or simply gone, washed away by the sea. Ports, the lifelines for heavy supplies, are choked with wreckage and silt. Fuel for trucks and generators becomes as precious as medicine. At airports, mountains of aid begin to pile up boxes of blankets, food, and medical supplies, but getting them to the people who need them most is a logistical nightmare. In this gridlock, a new force emerges. Local volunteers, fishermen who lost their boats now navigate debris-filled waters on salvaged planks. Students who lost their schools now carry sacks of rice through knee-deep mud. They are the true lifelines, their knowledge of the terrain and their community making them indispensable. Amidst this vast operation, individual stories of incredible resilience flicker like candles in the wind. In Banda Aceh, a nurse works tirelessly in a makeshift clinic. Her hands are stiff and raw from salt water, but she never stops, triaging patients, cleaning wounds, and offering a steady voice in the midst of panic. Further south, in Thailand, a lifeguard returns to the flattened beachfront where his resort once stood. He finds a piece of chalkboard and begins to write down the names of the survivors he finds, creating a public ledger of the living. In Sri Lanka, a Buddhist monk and a Catholic priest, their own places of worship damaged, work together to organize a shared shelter in a community hall, their faiths united by a common purpose. And out at sea, an Indian Coast Guard crew spots movement on a tiny, isolated sandbar. They carefully maneuver their vessel, ferrying a small group of injured and terrified survivors back to the relative safety of the mainland. Understanding the why behind this devastation offers a chilling clarity. The earthquake that triggered it all wasn't just a tremor. It was a colossal, geological event. The rupture along the seafloor stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers the length of California. For 8 to 10 agonizing minutes, the Earth's crust tore apart. In some areas, the seafloor was violently thrust upwards by several meters, displacing a volume of water that is almost impossible to comprehend. This is what resculpted entire coastlines, turning gentle bays into death traps. The unique geographies of the land, the shape of the headlands, and the funnels of the bays ampli, the waves concentrating their destructive power with terrifying efficiency. The science doesn't diminish the tragedy. It illuminates the sheer, raw power of the planet we inhabit. But sometimes, the most powerful moments are found in the silence. It's the profound stillness that falls after the last helicopter of the day departs, leaving behind a landscape cloaked in twilight and grief. It's the quiet rustle of paper as people scan the endless lists of the missing, taped to gates, walls, and telephone poles. It's the gut-wrenching moment a finger traces a line to a familiar name, followed by a sob of relief or a cry of despair, or the hollow emptiness when a name is simply not there, lost to the sea. As the days turn into a week, the mission slowly, painfully, shifts. The frantic search for survivors gives way to the solemn task of recovery. And with this shift, the true, staggering toll begins to emerge from the wreckage. Over 230,000 lives lost across 14 countries, entire neighborhoods, entire villages, wiped from the map, their existence now marked only by foundations and memories. The scale of the loss is almost too vast to grasp. At dusk, a final search party makes its way back along a debris-strewn beach. A last radio call crackles, reporting nothing new. In the fading light, a small group of survivors stands together, looking out at the ocean that took everything. They are faced with a question that hangs heavy in the air. How do you even begin to remember? How do you rebuild from this? In the days that followed, the true scale of the tragedy began to unfold. The world watched in horror as mass burials became a grim necessity, an act of public health to prevent further loss. In makeshift morgues and open fields, the painstaking work of identification began. Families, clutching worn photographs, walked endless rows, their silent pleas hanging in the heavy air. Across the globe, memorial prayers echoed in mosques, temples, and churches. On empty beaches, where laughter once filled the air, Now only the soft glow of candles flickered against the encroaching dusk. Each flame, a life remembered. The people we followed through this nightmare found their own ways to reckon with the abyss. The exhausted nurse, her hands raw, continued writing names in a book no one wanted to keep, a testament to lives that were more than just numbers. On a stripped and naked shoreline in Thailand, the lifeguard who had pulled so many from the water stood among hundreds at a candlelit vigil, his gaze fixed on the calm, indifferent sea. In Sri Lanka, a survivor from the Queen of the Sea train returned to the twisted tracks, placing a single flower where a loved one had sat. And in Phuket, those who had listened to a 10-year-old girl named Tilly Smith, who remembered her geography lesson about receding seas, gathered on the high ground where they had fled. They were the living proof that knowledge, even in the hands of a child, is a powerful shield. The water eventually drained away, but it left behind a world irrevocably changed. Fields once fertile were now poisoned with salt, unable to grow crops. The fishing industry, the lifeblood of countless coastal communities, with shattered boats smashed, nets gone, harbors destroyed. A generation of children became orphans in a single morning. Their trauma, a silent wound that would linger long after the physical scars healed. The psychological toll was immense. A quiet, pervasive current of grief and fear running beneath the surface of daily life. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming devastation, humanity responded. The world mounted the largest relief effort in history up to that time. Aid poured in from every corner of the globe. Gradually, painstakingly, the monumental task of reconstruction began. But this was not just about rebuilding what was lost. It was about rebuilding smarter, safer. Homes were raised on stilts, designed to let the water pass beneath them. Evacuation routes were painted in bold, bright colors on roads, constant reminders of where to go when the sirens sound. Communities came together to replant mangrove belts, nature's own formidable barrier against the sea's fury. The debate over seawalls, their cost, their effectiveness, their impact on the environment became a common conversation in coastal towns. This day, this singular, catastrophic event, fundamentally altered our relationship with the ocean. It exposed a terrifying vulnerability and, in doing so, forced a global change. The Indian Ocean's tsunami warning system was born from this tragedy, a network of seismic sensors, deep ocean buoys, and communication links designed to give coastal populations the one thing they didn't have in 2004. Time. Now, sirens and public drills are a part of life. School children learned the lessons Tilly Smith knew. When the sea mysteriously disappears, it's not a curiosity, it's a warning. The distant roar is not the sound of thunder. It is the sound that means run for your life. Today, if you visit those coastlines, the memory is etched into the landscape. You'll see a rebuilt house, windows open to the same vast ocean, but built on higher ground. You might hear a bell, high on a hill, ready to ring out a warning. You'll find signs, clear and simple, pointing the way to safety. These are not just monuments to loss. They are symbols of an unbreakable spirit. They honor our profound fragility in the face of nature's power, but they also stand as a testament to our resilience, our capacity to learn, to adapt, and to protect one another. If stories like this matter because they teach us about science, survival, and the strength of the human heart, then subscribe for more true stories of disasters that shook the world and forever changed it. Thank you for watching.